July 20th, 1969. The summer night was warm in Moscow, the kind of evening when the city's residents would normally stroll along the boulevards or gather in parks. But inside the Kremlin, in a secure conference room deep within the ancient fortress walls, the air was cold with air conditioning and colder still with tension. 5 men sat around a polished table, their faces illuminated by the bluish glow of a television monitor that had been wheeled into the room on a metal cart. The image on the screen was grainy, ghostly, transmitted across 240,000 miles of space. A bulky figure in a white suit descended a ladder, moved carefully onto a gray surface, and spoke words that would echo through history. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Leonid Brezhnev, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, sat at the head of the table. At 62, he was a man of peasant stock who had risen through party ranks by being reliable, cautious, and politically astute. His thick eyebrows were drawn together in a scowl. His hands, large and blunt-fingered, gripped the armrests of his chair. He said nothing. To his right sat Dmitry Ustinov, the Minister of Defense Industries, the man responsible for the Soviet Union's military-industrial complex. To his left, Mstislav Keldysh, President of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, the public face of Soviet space achievements. Across the table sat Vasily Mishin, Chief Designer of Spacecraft, the man who had inherited an impossible task. And at the far end, taking notes with mechanical precision, sat a young aide whose name history would not remember but whose transcript would survive in the archives. On the television, Neil Armstrong took another step on the lunar surface. The image jerked and blurred, then steadied. Buzz Aldrin descended the ladder to join him. The 2 astronauts moved in the strange, bouncing gait that 1/6 gravity imposed, planting an American flag in the lunar soil. The aide heard Brezhnev exhale slowly through his nose, not quite a sigh, not quite a grunt, but a sound that conveyed volumes. When the General Secretary finally spoke, his voice was flat, carefully devoid of emotion. "So, they have done it." No one responded immediately. What was there to say? For 12 years, since Sputnik had announced Soviet supremacy in space, the world had watched the 2 superpowers race toward this moment. And now, in a cramped room in the Kremlin, 5 men who represented the pinnacle of Soviet power sat watching their defeat. Broadcast live from the surface of another world. Keldysh cleared his throat, his academic instinct searching for the proper framework to discuss the undiscussable. "Comrade General Secretary, we must acknowledge this as a significant technical achievement. The Americans have solved problems that our program has been working to overcome." "Working to overcome," Brezhnev repeated, his voice acquiring an edge. "A diplomatic way of saying we failed." Mishin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. As chief designer, he was the most exposed man in the room, the one who would bear the blame for the Soviet Union's absence from the moon. He was 52 years old, brilliant in his way, but he was not Sergei Korolev. Korolev, the genius who had put Sputnik and Gagarin into space, had died 3 years earlier on an operating table, his body worn out by years in Stalin's labor camps and decades of crushing pressure. Mishin had inherited Korolev's position, but not his authority, not his vision, and certainly not his luck. "Comrade General Secretary," Mishin began carefully, "the N-1 rocket program has experienced setbacks, but we are making progress. The next launch," Brezhnev interrupted, his voice rising slightly, "will be the 5th attempt or the 6th. I lose count of the failures. The 4th, Comrade General Secretary. And each failure has taught us, each failure has taught the Americans that we cannot match them." Brezhnev's fist came down on the table, not violently but with enough force to make the point. "Each failure has been a propaganda gift to Washington. Each failure has made us look weak, incompetent, backward." The room fell silent. On the television, Armstrong and Aldrin were conducting experiments, setting up equipment, moving with the confidence of men who had achieved the impossible. The broadcast was being transmitted around the world. Hundreds of millions of people were watching. And not one of them was watching a Soviet cosmonaut. To understand the bitterness in that room, one must understand how completely the situation had reversed. In 1957, the Soviet Union had shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin had become the first human in space, orbiting the Earth while America's Mercury program was still conducting suborbital test flights. Through the early 1960s, the Soviets had maintained their lead: first woman in space, first spacewalk, first probe to impact the moon. The Americans had been playing catch-up, and they had been losing. But then, on May 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy had made his famous speech to Congress, committing America to landing a man on the moon before the decade was out. It had seemed like fantasy, like American arrogance. The Soviets had laughed at it privately. How could a nation that couldn't even match Soviet achievements in Earth orbit possibly reach the moon first? Yet Kennedy's commitment had unleashed something the Soviets couldn't match: resources. America poured money into the Apollo program, $25 billion over 8 years, nearly $25 billion over 8 years, nearly $200 billion in today's dollars. NASA's budget peaked at 4.4% of the federal budget. Hundreds of thousands of engineers, scientists, and technicians worked on Apollo. American industry retooled to support it. Universities trained specialists for it. It became a national crusade. The Soviet space program, by contrast, remained fragmented and underfunded. Different design bureaus competed for resources and prestige. The military and civilian programs worked at cross purposes. Most critically, after Korolev's death in 1966, there was no single visionary to drive the program forward. Mishin was competent, but he lacked Korolev's ability to navigate Soviet politics, to secure funding, to inspire his engineers. The N-1 rocket, the Soviet answer to America's Saturn V, was a perfect example of the problems. It was designed to be powerful enough to send cosmonauts to the moon, but it was underfunded, undertested, and plagued by technical problems. Unlike the Saturn V, which had been tested exhaustively on the ground, the N-1 had never undergone a full ground test of all its engines firing together. It was too expensive, Soviet officials had decided. They would test it by launching it. The first launch in February 1969 had failed after 70 seconds when vibrations shut down the engines. The second launch in July 1969, just weeks before Apollo 11, had been catastrophic. The rocket had exploded on the launch pad in the largest non-nuclear explosion in human history, destroying the launch facility and setting the program back by years. And now, while Soviet engineers were still analyzing the wreckage, American astronauts were walking on the moon. On the television, President Richard Nixon appeared on a split screen, speaking to the astronauts via radio link. "Neil and Buzz, I am talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House, and this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made." Ustinov, the defense minister, spoke for the first time. His voice was cold, analytical, the voice of a man who dealt in missiles and warheads, not dreams and exploration. "Comrade General Secretary, we must consider the strategic implications. The Americans have demonstrated a heavy lift capability that exceeds our own. The Saturn V rocket could be adapted for military purposes. Their guidance systems, their computing technology, all of this has applications beyond space exploration." Brezhnev nodded slowly. This was language he understood. Strategic implications, military applications. The space race had never been just about space. It had always been about demonstrating technological superiority, about showing the world which system, capitalism or communism, could achieve the impossible. And today, capitalism had won. "What do we tell our people?" Brezhnev asked, directing the question to no one in particular. "What do we tell the world? For 12 years, we have claimed superiority in space. We put the first satellite in orbit. We put the first man in space. We have told our people that socialist science is superior to capitalist science. And now, He gestured at the television where Armstrong and Aldrin continued their lunar activities, their every move broadcast to the planet they had left behind. Keldysh, the scientist, spoke carefully. "Comrade General Secretary, we could emphasize the scientific achievements we have made. Our lunar program has successfully returned soil samples from the moon using unmanned probes. This is actually more efficient than sending men." "Efficiency," Brezhnev's voice dripped with contempt. "You think the world cares about efficiency? You think anyone will remember that we sent robots while the Americans sent heroes? This is not about science, Comrade Keldysh. This is about prestige. This is about power. This is about which system the world believes in." He stood abruptly, walking to the window. Outside, Moscow stretched into the distance, a city rebuilt from the ashes of World War II, a symbol of Soviet resilience and strength. But tonight, that strength felt hollow. "We will say nothing," Brezhnev announced, his back to the room. "TASS will not report this. Our newspapers will not carry the story. Our television will not show these images. As far as the Soviet people are concerned, this did not happen." Mishin looked up sharply. "Comrade General Secretary, with respect, the Voice of America broadcasts reach into the Soviet Union. The BBC World Service reaches our people. They will hear about this whether we report it or not." "Then they will hear about it from enemy propaganda," Brezhnev said, turning back to face the room, "which our people know to discount. But if we report it ourselves, if we acknowledge it officially, we legitimize it. We make it real. Better to say nothing than to celebrate our own defeat." It was a quintessentially Soviet solution. If reality is unpleasant, simply deny that reality exists. It had worked for Stalin during the purges, for Khrushchev during the Hungarian uprising, for every Soviet leader who had faced inconvenient truths. Why should it not work now? Ustinov spoke again, his voice pragmatic. "We should consider terminating the N-1 program. The Americans have won the moon race. There is no point in continuing to pour resources into a program that cannot catch up. We should redirect those resources to areas where we can still compete: space stations, long-duration missions, military applications." Mishin's face went pale. The N-1 was his program, his responsibility, his chance to emerge from Korolev's shadow. "Comrade Minister, we are so close. The next launch will fail, like all the others," Ustinov said bluntly. "You have had 4 attempts, 4 failures. How many more failures before you admit the program is not viable?" "The Americans had failures too." Mishin's voice rose, desperation creeping in. "Apollo 1 killed 3 astronauts. Their rocket program had setbacks, but they persevered. If we give up now, the Americans persevered because they had unlimited resources and political will," Brezhnev interrupted. "We have neither. The Politburo has been asking questions about the space program budget for years. How much are we spending? What are we getting in return? I have defended the program because it brought us prestige, but what prestige is there in failure?" He returned to his seat, his decision made but not yet spoken. On the television, the astronauts were preparing to return to their lunar module. Their mission was nearly complete. They would lift off from the moon, rendezvous with Michael Collins in the command module, and return to Earth as heroes. Ticker tape parades awaited them. History books would celebrate them. Their names would be remembered for as long as human civilization endured. And the Soviet cosmonauts who had trained for the same mission, who had prepared to be the first humans on the moon, would be forgotten. Their names would be classified. Their training would be denied. They would become ghosts, erased from history, because history had chosen a different victor. Keldysh made one more attempt. "Comrade General Secretary, even if we cannot match the American moon landing, we should continue our space program. There are other achievements possible: Mars probes, Venus landers, space stations. We can still demonstrate Soviet capabilities. Brezhnev considered this. Yes, we will continue the space program, but we will change its focus. No more moon race. That race is over, and we lost. We will emphasize practical applications, space stations for long-duration research, satellites for communications and reconnaissance, programs that serve Soviet interests, not American propaganda narratives. He looked directly at Mishin. The N-1 program will continue for now, but it will be under review. If the next launch fails, it will be terminated. Am I clear? Mishin nodded, his face a mask of professional composure that barely concealed his devastation. He knew what under review meant in Soviet bureaucracy. It meant the program was already dead. They just hadn't made it official yet. The meeting was ending. The men began to gather their papers, preparing to leave. But Brezhnev remained seated, his eyes still on the television screen. Armstrong and Aldrin had climbed back into their lunar module. Soon they would lift off, beginning their journey home. The historic moment was passing, slipping into history, and the Soviet Union had been a spectator, not a participant. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Brezhnev said quietly, almost to himself. "It's not that they beat us. It's that they made it look easy. They made it look inevitable, as if American success was always destined and Soviet success was always temporary." No one responded. What could they say? The television showed the lunar module's ascent stage firing its engine, lifting off from the moon's surface in a spray of lunar dust. The camera, left behind by the astronauts, captured the moment perfectly. Even the camera work was flawless, choreographed, professional. The Americans had thought of everything. In the days that followed, the Soviet media maintained an eerie silence about Apollo 11. While the rest of the world celebrated, Soviet newspapers buried brief mentions of the mission on inside pages, treating it as a minor technical achievement of no particular significance. Soviet television showed no footage. Soviet radio provided no commentary. It was as if 500 million people around the world had witnessed something that had not actually happened. But within the Soviet space program, the impact was devastating. Morale collapsed. Engineers who had worked for years toward a Soviet moon landing found their projects canceled or indefinitely delayed. The N-1 program limped forward for 4 more years, with 2 more catastrophic failures before being officially terminated in 1974. The Soviet Union would never attempt a manned lunar landing. Instead, as Brezhnev had directed, the program pivoted to space stations, Salyut, and later Mir, where Soviet cosmonauts would set records for long-duration spaceflight. They would achieve genuine scientific and technical accomplishments, but these achievements would never capture the public imagination the way the moon landing had. They would never be the stuff of legend. For the men in that conference room on July 20th, 1969, the American moon landing represented more than a lost race. It represented a fundamental shift in the Cold War's trajectory. For 12 years, since Sputnik, the Soviet Union had been able to claim technological superiority. That claim had now been shattered, and with it, a crucial element of Soviet prestige. Brezhnev's decision to ignore the moon landing, to pretend it hadn't happened, was a tacit admission of defeat. It was the response of a regime that could not compete on merit, and so chose to compete in the realm of information control. But information, in 1969, was becoming harder to control. Radio broadcasts penetrated borders, smuggled magazines circulated in underground networks. Soviet citizens knew that something historic had happened, even if their own media wouldn't acknowledge it. The moon landing marked the beginning of a long decline in Soviet confidence. It would be another 20 years before the Soviet Union collapsed, but the seeds of that collapse were visible in that moment. The inability to match Western technological achievement, the resort to propaganda over reality, the growing gap between what Soviet citizens were told and what they could see with their own eyes. What Soviet leaders said when Americans walked on the moon was ultimately nothing. They said nothing publicly, admitted nothing officially, acknowledged nothing in their media. But their silence spoke volumes. It was the silence of defeat, of humiliation, of a system that had promised to overtake and surpass the West, but had instead fallen behind. In private, in that conference room, they had spoken the truth. They have done it. 3 words that contained an entire universe of meaning: admiration and resentment, recognition and denial. The acknowledgement that in this contest, at this moment, capitalism had proven more capable than communism. American ingenuity had surpassed Soviet determination, and the future belonged to those who could adapt and innovate, not those who could merely endure. The moon landing was America's triumph, but it was also the Soviet Union's moment of reckoning, the moment when the illusion of inevitable communist victory began to crack, when the narrative of Soviet superiority began to unravel, when the future that Lenin and Stalin had promised started to look less like destiny and more like delusion. And it had all happened on television, broadcast live, impossible to ignore or deny, a moment of truth that no amount of propaganda could obscure. The Americans had walked on the moon, and the Soviets, despite 12 years of space achievements, despite Gagarin and Sputnik and all the firsts they had claimed, could only watch and say nothing. Sometimes silence is the loudest admission of defeat.